The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine driveway as Michelle Anderson pulled up to the towering gates of the Richardson estate. Her hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel of her worn-down Honda Civic, a stark contrast to the luxury that surrounded her. At 42, she never imagined she'd be starting over as a housekeeper, but life had a way of throwing unexpected curves. 20 years ago, she had made the hardest decision of her life, giving up her newborn son for adoption. She was barely 22 then, working 3 jobs and drowning in debt. The choice haunted her every day since, but she convinced herself it was for the best. Her son would have opportunities she could never provide. Now, after losing her job as an office manager during company-wide layoffs, she found herself answering a job posting for a live-in housekeeper position at one of the most prestigious addresses in the city. The salary was generous, and the position included accommodations, a blessing considering her current financial situation. Taking a deep breath, she pressed the intercom button. "Hello, I'm Michelle Anderson, the new housekeeper." The gates opened with a smooth mechanical hum, and she drove up the winding driveway, her heart pounding with each turn. The mansion was even more impressive up close, 3 stories of architectural magnificence with perfectly manicured gardens. As she parked in the designated staff area, a warm voice called out to her. "Welcome to Richardson Estate." An elderly woman with kind eyes approached, introducing herself as Mrs. Jenkins, the head of household staff. "Thank you," Michelle replied, trying to mask her nervousness. Mrs. Jenkins led her through a side entrance, explaining the daily routines and responsibilities. The interior was just as breathtaking: marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and priceless artwork adorning the walls. "Mr. Richardson is a busy businessman, but very fair," Mrs. Jenkins explained. "His adopted son, Thomas, is away at college but visits frequently. You'll need to maintain his wing of the house as well." Michelle nodded, taking mental notes as they continued the tour. As they walked through the family wing, Michelle's attention was drawn to a large family portrait. Her steps faltered, and her breath caught in her throat. There, smiling back at her, was a young man who could have been her twin at that age, the same deep-set eyes, the same gentle smile, even the same dimple in his left cheek. "That's Thomas," Mrs. Jenkins said proudly, noticing Michelle's intense gaze. "Mr. Richardson adopted him 20 years ago. Such a blessing to this household." 20 years ago. Michelle's world began to spin. The timeline, the resemblance, it couldn't be coincidence. But she couldn't let her emotions show, not now, not when she desperately needed this job. She forced a smile and continued the tour, but her mind was racing. Later that evening, alone in her new staff quarters, Michelle sat on the edge of her bed, holding a worn photograph, the only picture she had kept of her newborn son. The same eyes, the same smile. She had prayed for years to find him, and now, by some twist of fate, she might be working in the very house where he grew up. But what should she do with this information? Would revealing the truth cost her this job? Would it turn Thomas's world upside down? And what about Mr. Richardson? How would he react to having his son's biological mother working as his housekeeper? As she prepared for bed, Michelle made a decision. She would take things slow, observe, and gather more information. If Thomas was indeed her son, she owed it to him to handle this revelation with care. For now, she would focus on proving herself as a capable housekeeper while carefully watching for any more signs that might confirm her suspicions. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Michelle lay awake, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the massive house, her mind replaying every detail of the family portrait. Tomorrow would begin her first full day at the Richardson estate, and with it, possibly the first chapter in reuniting with the son she had never stopped loving. Michelle's first week at the Richardson estate passed in a whirlwind of activity. Each morning, she threw herself into her duties, learning the rhythms of the household. The physical work helped keep her mind from constantly wandering to the family portrait and the questions that plagued her dreams. Mr. Richardson, she learned, was rarely home before evening, managing his technology empire from a downtown office. When he did return, he was surprisingly down-to-earth for someone of his status, always greeting the staff with genuine warmth and asking about their day. One evening, while dusting the family room, Michelle's attention was drawn to a collection of photo albums displayed on the bottom shelf. Her hands trembled as she opened one, knowing she shouldn't but unable to resist. Inside were photographs documenting Thomas's childhood, his first day of school, birthday parties, family vacations. Her heart ached seeing all the moments she'd missed. "Those are my favorite memories," a voice said behind her, making her jump. Mr. Richardson stood in the doorway, his tie loosened after a long day at the office. Michelle quickly closed the album, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. "I'm so sorry, sir. I was just dusting Anne." He waved off her apology with a kind smile. "Please, don't worry. And call me Robert. Thomas was such a blessing to this family. His birth mother made an incredible sacrifice, giving him up so he could have better opportunities. I've always hoped she knows how wonderfully he turned out." Michelle's throat tightened. That must have been a difficult decision for her, she managed to say, her voice barely steady. "I imagine it was," Robert replied, picking up one of the albums. "You know, Thomas is coming home this weekend for a visit. He's studying medicine at university, wants to become a pediatrician. Says he wants to help children the way he was helped." Michelle nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Her son, if he truly was her son, wanted to become a doctor. Pride and grief warred in her heart. Later that night, unable to sleep, Michelle pulled out her old journal from her bag. Inside was the paperwork from the adoption agency, carefully preserved for 2 decades. The date matched perfectly with Thomas's age. But what caught her eye was something she'd overlooked before: the name of the agency, Richardson Family Services. Her hands shook as she Googled the agency on her phone. It had closed 15 years ago, but archived articles revealed it had been owned by Robert Richardson's late father. The pieces were falling into place. Thomas hadn't been randomly adopted by the Richardsons, he had come to them through their family's agency. The next morning, while cleaning Thomas's room, Michelle found herself studying every detail. Medical textbooks were stacked neatly on the desk. A collection of vintage cameras lined one shelf. Photography must be his hobby. On the bulletin board, among various photos of friends and family, one picture stood out. It showed Thomas at what appeared to be an adoption awareness event, speaking to a crowd. Mrs. Jenkins appeared in the doorway. "That was last year," she said, noticing Michelle's interest in the photo. "Thomas started an organization at his university that helps connect adopted children with their biological parents. He believes everyone deserves to know their roots." Michelle's heart skipped a beat. "That's wonderful," she whispered. "It comes from his own curiosity, I think," Mrs. Jenkins continued. "He's always wondered about his birth mother. Even hired a private investigator once, but the agency's records were sealed when it closed." The revelation hit Michelle like a physical blow. Her son had been searching for her, just as she had been searching for him. But now that fate had brought them together, she felt paralyzed by fear. What if he resented her? What if the truth destroyed the beautiful life he'd built? As Friday approached, the household buzzed with preparation for Thomas's visit. Michelle watched the staff preparing his favorite meals, fluffing pillows in his room, and sharing excited stories about the young man who had clearly touched all their hearts. That evening, while arranging fresh flowers in the foyer, Thomas's favorite lilies, she'd learned, Michelle heard a car pull up outside. Her heart began to race. Through the window, she could see a young man emerging from a sleek black car, his resemblance to her unmistakable even at a distance. 20 years of separation were about to end. But as voices approached the front door, Michelle slipped quietly into the shadows of the service corridor. She wasn't ready. Not yet. First, she needed to understand the man her son had become, and more importantly, find the courage to face the consequences of revealing the truth. As she retreated to her room, Michelle could hear the joyful reunion happening in the foyer, laughing, questions about university, the sounds of a loving family. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she realized that while she might be Thomas's birth mother, Robert Richardson had given him something she couldn't have provided 2 decades ago, a stable, nurturing home filled with opportunities and unconditional love. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. For now, Michelle sat at her small desk and began writing in her journal, pouring out her hopes and fears. Whatever happened next would change not just her life, but the lives of everyone in this house. She had to be certain she was doing the right thing, not just for herself, but for the son she had loved enough to let go. The next morning, Michelle woke before dawn, her heart racing at the thought of inevitably crossing paths with Thomas. She dressed carefully in her staff uniform, taking extra time to smooth her hair, a nervous habit she'd never outgrown. The morning sun was just beginning to paint the sky when she started her daily routine, hoping to complete the main floor cleaning before the family awoke. But fate had other plans. As she quietly dusted the grand piano in the living room, soft footsteps approached from behind. Michelle turned to find Thomas standing there in sweatpants and a university hoodie, looking exactly like she did at his age. "Sorry, I didn't mean to startle you," he said with a warm smile, her smile. "I'm an early riser. Med school habit, I guess." "You must be Michelle? Mrs. Jenkins mentioned we had a new housekeeper." "Yes, that's me," she managed to reply, her hands gripping the duster tightly. "It's nice to meet you, properly." Up close, the resemblance was undeniable. He had her eyes, her smile, even the way he stood with one hand casually in his pocket, a gesture she'd seen in her own reflection countless times. "Would you like some coffee?" Thomas offered. "I was just heading to the kitchen to make a pot. Dad and Mrs. Jenkins won't be up for hours, and honestly, I could use some company. Hospital rotations have made me too used to pre-dawn conversations." Before she could form an excuse, he was already walking toward the kitchen, clearly expecting her to follow. Michelle's feet moved of their own accord, drawn by an invisible thread that had connected them for 20 years. In the kitchen, Thomas moved with familiar ease, preparing coffee while chatting about his medical studies. Michelle sat at the staff table, watching him measure coffee grounds with the precise attention of a future doctor. Every gesture, every expression was a mirror of her own mannerisms. "You know," Thomas said, setting 2 steaming mugs on the table, "there's something familiar about you. Have we met before?" Michelle's heart stopped for a moment. "I don't think so," she said carefully, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. "I just started here last week." He mused, studying her face. "Maybe you remind me of someone. I've always wondered about my birth mother, you see. Been trying to find her for years." The coffee suddenly felt thick in Michelle's throat. "What would you say to her? If you found her?" The question slipped out before she could stop herself. Thomas's expression grew thoughtful. "You know, I've played that scenario in my head 1,000 times. At first, when I was younger, I was angry. Couldn't understand how someone could give away their child. But as I got older, especially after starting med school and seeing so many different life situations, I realized things aren't always black and white." He paused, taking a sip of coffee. "Now, I mostly just want to thank her. Tell her that her decision, as hard as it must have been, gave me an amazing life. Dad's been incredible, and I've had opportunities one might never have had otherwise. But I'd also want her to know that I understand. That I don't judge her." Tears pricked at Michelle's eyes, and she quickly dabbed at them with her sleeve. "Sorry," she mumbled. "That's just, very touching." "Hey, no need to apologize," Thomas said gently. "Actually, I'm giving a speech next weekend at an adoption awareness event. It's something I'm passionate about, helping other adoptees and birth parents connect, if they want to. Would you like to come? We always need volunteers, and Dad's usually too busy with work to attend. The invitation caught Michelle off guard. I'd like that, she found herself saying. Maybe seeing him speak about adoption would help her gauge how he might react to the truth. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps. Robert Richardson entered the kitchen, already dressed for the office despite the early hour. Thomas. I thought I heard voices. And Michelle, you're up early. Just getting to know our new housekeeper, Dad, Thomas explained. Did you know she makes better coffee than Mrs. Jenkins? Robert laughed. Don't let Mrs. Jenkins hear you say that. He poured himself a cup, then turned to Michelle. I hope my son isn't keeping you from your duties. Not at all, Sir Robert, Michelle corrected herself. I should get back to work, though. She stood, gathering her composure. Thank you for the coffee, Thomas. As she left the kitchen, she could hear father and son falling into easy conversation about Thomas's medical studies. The sound made her heart ache with a complex mixture of joy and sadness. Joy that her son had grown up with such love, sadness for all the moments she'd missed. Throughout the day, Michelle caught glimpses of Thomas as he moved through the house, playing the piano in the living room, studying medical texts in the garden, helping Mrs. Jenkins with dinner preparations. Each sighting was both a gift and a torment. She saw herself in his laugh, his gestures, the way he pushed his hair back when concentrating. That evening, while cleaning the library, she overheard a conversation between Thomas and Robert in the adjacent study. They were discussing the upcoming adoption awareness event. Dad, I think I'm getting close to finding her, Thomas was saying. The private investigator found new leads at the county records office. Apparently, there was a fire at the agency, but some documents survived. Son, Robert's voice was gentle, I support your search, you know that. But are you prepared for what you might find? Or if she doesn't want to be found? I have to try, Thomas replied firmly. I have so many questions. Like this weird genetic thing, the doctor mentioned during my last physical that my heart murmur is likely hereditary. It would be good to know the family medical history, if nothing else. Michelle's hand flew to her chest, where her own heart murmur had caused concerns during her pregnancy. Another piece of evidence, another connection she couldn't deny. The weight of her secret felt heavier with each passing moment. Later, in her room, Michelle pulled out her phone and looked up the adoption awareness event Thomas had mentioned. As she read about his organization and its mission to connect families separated by adoption, she made a decision. She would attend the event, hear him speak, and then find the right moment to tell him the truth. But as she lay in bed that night, listening to the distant sound of Thomas playing the piano downstairs, Michelle wondered if she was being selfish. He had a good life, a loving father, a promising future. Did she have the right to potentially disrupt all of that? The same questions that had tortured her 20 years ago now returned with new urgency. What was truly best for her son? The weekend passed too quickly, filled with stolen moments and hidden glances. Michelle watched from the shadows as Thomas packed his bag Sunday evening, preparing to return to medical school. Each time he hugged his father goodbye, her heart twisted with a familiar ache. Don't forget about next weekend's event, Thomas reminded her as she carried fresh towels past his room. I'll email you the details. We could really use your help with registration. Michelle nodded, trying to keep her voice steady. I wouldn't miss it. She had already requested the day off from Mrs. Jenkins, who seemed delighted by her interest in Thomas's cause. After Thomas left, the house felt emptier somehow. Michelle threw herself into her work, scrubbing floors that were already clean, organizing closets that didn't need organizing, anything to keep her mind occupied. But every corner of the mansion held echoes of his presence. One afternoon, while cleaning Thomas's bathroom, she found a small prescription bottle that had fallen behind the counter. Her hand trembled as she read the label, medication for a heart condition, the same one she'd taken since her teens. Another undeniable connection between them. That evening, Robert called her into his study. Michelle's heart raced, wondering if he had somehow discovered her secret. But his expression was friendly as he gestured for her to sit. "Michelle, I wanted to thank you for taking an interest in Thomas's adoption work," he said, leaning back in his leather chair. "It means a lot to him. You know, when I adopted him, I promised myself I'd always be honest about his adoption story. But sometimes I wonder if I've done enough to help him find his birth mother." Michelle's fingers twisted in her lap. "You seem like a wonderful father," she managed to say. Robert's eyes grew distant. "The day I first held him, he was so tiny, so perfect. The social worker told me his birth mother was young, struggling financially. She wanted him to have opportunities she couldn't provide." He paused, studying Michelle's face. "You remind me a bit of her, actually. Same kind eyes." Michelle felt the blood drain from her face. "The birth mother, did you ever meet her?" "No," Robert sighed. "The adoption was closed. All I know is what was in the file. She was 22, working multiple jobs, living in a small apartment across town. She wrote a letter to be given to Thomas when he turned 18, but it was lost when the agency closed." Michelle remembered writing that letter, pouring her heart onto pages that would now never reach their intended recipient. "She must think about him every day," she whispered. "I'm sure she does," Robert agreed. "You know, sometimes I look at Thomas and try to imagine what she might see if she met him now. Would she recognize herself in him? Would she be proud of the man he's become?" Tears threatened to spill from Michelle's eyes. "Excuse me," she said quickly, standing up. "I should finish my evening duties." That night, Michelle couldn't sleep. She paced her small room, remembering the letter she'd written 20 years ago. Perhaps it was time to write a new one. She pulled out her journal and began to write. "Dear Thomas. For 20 years, I've carried you in my heart. Every birthday, every holiday, every ordinary day, I've wondered about you. Now, by some miracle or twist of fate, I find myself living under the same roof where you grew up, seeing firsthand the wonderful man you've become." The words flowed freely now, everything she'd wanted to tell him but couldn't. She wrote about her reasons for giving him up, about watching him from afar these past weeks, about her pride in his accomplishments and the person he'd grown to be. As dawn approached, Michelle made a decision. She would attend the adoption awareness event, but instead of volunteering at registration, she would sign up as a birth mother looking to connect with her child. She would follow the proper channels, let Thomas's own organization facilitate their reunion. It seemed fitting somehow. The next few days passed in a blur of preparation. Michelle researched Thomas's organization, learning that they required documentation from both parties before facilitating any meetings. She gathered her old adoption paperwork, her medical records showing the shared heart condition, the few photographs she had from the hospital. On Thursday, Mrs. Jenkins found her in the laundry room, carefully ironing her best outfit for the weekend event. "You've taken quite an interest in young Thomas's work," she observed, helping her smooth out a stubborn wrinkle. "It's an important cause," Michelle replied carefully. Mrs. Jenkins gave her a long look. "You know, in all my years working here, I've never seen anyone look at Thomas quite the way you do. Like you're seeing a ghost, or maybe a miracle." Michelle's hands stilled on the iron. "Mrs. Jenkins." The older woman patted her arm gently. "Don't worry, dear. We all have our secrets. But I've learned that the truth has a way of coming out, one way or another. The question is whether we choose the timing or let fate decide for us." That evening, as Michelle finished her duties, she heard Robert on the phone with Thomas in his study. "Son," the private investigator called. He may have found something, medical records from county hospital that matched the timeline. He thinks he might have your birth mother's name. Michelle's heart nearly stopped. She hadn't considered that Thomas's search might lead to her before she was ready to reveal herself. The timeline was shrinking, the carefully laid plans threatening to unravel. Should she wait for the private investigator's revelation? Or take control of the narrative herself? As she lay in bed that night, Michelle realized that Mrs. Jenkins was right. The truth would come out, one way or another. The only question was whether she would have the courage to speak it herself, or let circumstances force her hand. The adoption awareness event was 2 days away. 2 days to find the strength to change not just her life, but the lives of everyone in this house. Rolling over, she looked at the photo on her nightstand, the only one she had of herself holding newborn Thomas, taken moments before she handed him over to the adoption agency. Soon, she whispered to the image. Soon, we'll finish our story. The day before the adoption awareness event, the Richardson mansion buzzed with unusual energy. Michelle had just finished polishing the grand staircase when Robert burst from his study, phone pressed to his ear, his face a mix of excitement and concern. "Yes, I understand the sensitivity of the information," he was saying, pacing the foyer. "But if you're certain about these records..." "Yes, please email everything you have. Thomas needs to see this." Michelle's hand tightened on the polishing cloth. The private investigator must have found something concrete. Her carefully planned revelation at tomorrow's event suddenly felt like it might be too late. Later that afternoon, while dusting the family room, she overheard Robert on another call, this time with Thomas. "Son, I think he's found her." The investigator uncovered medical records from City General, a young woman with the same heart condition, same age, everything matches. "He's sending over the files tonight." Michelle retreated to the kitchen, her hands shaking as she made herself a cup of tea. Mrs. Jenkins found her there, staring into the steaming cup. "You look like you've seen a ghost, dear," the older woman said, sitting beside her. "Is everything all right?" "Mrs. Jenkins," Michelle began, her voice barely a whisper, "what would you do if you knew something that could change everyone's lives, but you were afraid of the consequences?" The head housekeeper studied her face carefully. "You know, I've worked for this family for 30 years. I was here the day Mr. Richardson brought Thomas home, tiny little thing, wrapped in a blue blanket. I've watched that boy grow up, seen him struggle with questions about his birth mother." She paused, placing a gentle hand over Michelle's trembling ones. "Sometimes, the truth hurts at first, but hiding it hurts longer." Tears spilled down Michelle's cheeks. "I never meant to hide. I didn't know he would be here when I took this job. But now..." "Now you're afraid," Mrs. Jenkins finished softly. "Of course you are. But I've seen how you look at him, how your eyes follow him when he's home. A mother's love can't be hidden forever." Michelle's head snapped up. "You knew?" "I suspected," Mrs. Jenkins smiled kindly. "The resemblance is striking, and your reaction to his photograph that first day, well, some things a mother can't hide." Before Michelle could respond, Robert's voice echoed from the study. "Michelle? Could you come here for a moment?" Her heart nearly stopped. Had the investigators' files already arrived? Mrs. Jenkins squeezed her hand. "Whatever happens, remember, this house has seen many storms, and we're still standing." Michelle walked to the study on shaky legs. Robert sat behind his desk, a stack of papers in front of him. "Please, sit down," he said, his expression unreadable. "Is everything all right, sir?" she managed to ask. "I've just received some interesting information from a private investigator," Robert began, studying her face. "We've been searching for Thomas's birth mother for years, and today, he sent us these records." He gestured to the papers. "Including employment history from 20 years ago." Michelle's throat went dry. "Oh. Yes. It seems Thomas's birth mother worked 3 jobs back then, waitressing at a diner, cleaning offices at night, and weekend shifts at a grocery store. He paused, picking up one of the papers. Just like you mentioned in your job application, Michelle. Under previous experience. The room seemed to spin. Michelle gripped the arms of her chair, trying to steady herself. At first, I thought it was a coincidence, Robert continued. But then I saw the medical records, the same heart condition Thomas has. And the photographs. He slid a grainy hospital photo across the desk, the very same one Michelle kept in her nightstand drawer. I can explain, she whispered. Please do, Robert said quietly. Because right now, I'm trying to understand why my son's birth mother has been working in my house for the past month without saying a word. The tears she'd been holding back finally spilled over. I didn't know he was here when I applied for the job. I saw the posting online, needed the work. When I arrived that first day and saw his picture, I couldn't believe it. I've thought about him every day for 20 years, and suddenly there he was. Why didn't you say something then? I was afraid, Michelle admitted. Afraid of losing the job, afraid of disrupting Thomas's life, afraid he would hate me for giving him up. Then I got to know him, saw what a wonderful person he's become, and I was even more afraid of ruining everything. Robert was quiet for a long moment. Do you know what Thomas asked me when he was 10 years old? He wanted to know if his birth mother ever loved him, or if she just saw him as a burden. He leaned forward. I told him that giving up a child takes more love than keeping one, that somewhere out there was a woman who loved him enough to put his needs before her own. Michelle covered her face with her hands, sobbing quietly. I did love him. I do love him. Every single day. I believe you, Robert said gently. And I think I understand why you kept quiet. But Thomas deserves to know the truth. He's flying in tonight for tomorrow's event. Michelle's head snapped up. Tonight? But I thought. He changed his plans after I told him about the investigators' findings. Michelle, he's been searching for you for years. Don't you think it's time to end that search? What if he hates me, she whispered. Robert's expression softened. The Thomas the first raised is incapable of hate. He has questions, yes. But mainly, he just wants to understand. To know where he comes from. He paused. The question is, are you ready to tell him? Michelle took a deep breath, steadying herself. I was planning to reveal everything at tomorrow's event. I have all the documentation, proof of who I am. Or, Robert interrupted, you could tell him tonight, here at home, where it's private. Where he can process everything without an audience. The thought of facing Thomas in just a few hours made Michelle's heart race. But Robert was right, this wasn't something that should happen in public. Her son deserved better than that. What time does his flight arrive? She asked quietly. 8 o'clock. Mrs. Jenkins is preparing his favorite dinner. Robert stood, walking around the desk to stand beside her. Michelle, I want you to know something. Adopting Thomas was the greatest gift of my life. And while I've always known this day might come, I never expected to find his birth mother under my own roof. He smiled slightly. Life has a strange way of bringing families together. As Michelle left the study on unsteady legs, Mrs. Jenkins was waiting in the hallway. Well? The older woman asked. Thomas is coming home tonight, Michelle said, her voice trembling. And it's time for the truth. Mrs. Jenkins pulled her into a warm embrace. Then let's get you ready to meet your son, properly this time. The hours before Thomas's arrival passed in a blur. Michelle changed her uniform 3 times, finally settling on a simple blue dress she'd bought for the awareness event. Mrs. Jenkins helped her style her hair, all while offering quiet words of encouragement. Even the other household staff seemed to sense the importance of the evening, moving through their duties with unusual solemnity. At 7:30, Robert called everyone into the kitchen. "Thomas will be here soon," he announced, looking directly at Michelle. "This evening will be significant for our family. I trust everyone will give us the privacy we need." The staff nodded, though Michelle noticed several curious glances in her direction. Mrs. Jenkins had kept her secret, but there was no hiding the tension in the air. "Would you like to wait in the living room?" Robert asked Michelle gently. "I'll pick Thomas up from the airport myself." Michelle shook her head. "If it's all right, I'd rather wait in my room until you've had a chance to talk to him first. He should hear the basics from you." As she sat in her small staff room, Michelle could hear the distant sounds of preparation, dishes clinking in the kitchen, soft footsteps in the hallway, the occasional murmur of voices. She pulled out her worn journal and the small box of mementos she'd kept for 20 years, the hospital bracelet from the day Thomas was born, a tiny blue cap, the first and only photo she'd taken with him. A car door slammed outside. Michelle's heart leaped to her throat. Through her window, she could see Robert and Thomas walking up the driveway, Thomas gesturing animatedly as he talked. Even from a distance, she could see the excitement in his movements. Muffled voices drifted up from below, father and son entering the house, greeting Mrs. Jenkins, moving toward Robert's study. Michelle closed her eyes, trying to steady her breathing. Everything was about to change. 10 minutes passed. 20. She could hear occasional raised voices from the study, though the words were unclear. Then footsteps in the hallway, getting closer. A soft knock at her door. "Michelle?" It was Robert. "We're ready for you. Thomas would like to meet you in the living room." The walk downstairs felt like the longest journey of her life. Each step brought her closer to the moment she'd dreamed of for 20 years. As she approached the living room, she could see Thomas standing by the fireplace, his back to the door. Robert squeezed her shoulder reassuringly before stepping away, giving them privacy. "Thomas?" Her voice was barely a whisper. He turned slowly. His eyes were red-rimmed, but there was something else in them, hope, perhaps. Wonder. "Is it really you?" he asked, his voice catching. Michelle nodded, unable to speak. She opened the small box she'd brought down, pulling out the hospital photo. "This was the only picture I could keep," she managed to say. "You were 6 hours old." Thomas crossed the room in 3 quick strides, taking the photo with trembling hands. "Dad showed me the investigator's files, but seeing you here." He looked up, studying her face. "Why didn't you tell me? When we had coffee that morning?" "I was scared," Michelle admitted. "I'd imagined finding you so many times, but when it actually happened, I didn't want to disrupt your life. You seemed so happy, so successful." "Did you know?" he asked. "When you applied for this job?" "No," she said firmly. "I saw the job posting online, needed the work. When I arrived that first day and saw your picture, I couldn't believe it. I thought I was dreaming." Thomas sank onto the sofa, still holding the photo. "All these years, I've had so many questions. Why did you give me up? Did you ever think about me? Did you ever want to find me?" Michelle sat beside him, careful to leave space between them. "I thought about you every single day. But I was 22, working 3 jobs, living in a tiny apartment with no heat. I could barely feed myself." She wiped away tears. "When I found out I was pregnant, I was terrified. I wanted you to have everything I couldn't give you, a stable home, education, opportunities. When I saw the Richardson Family Services Agency." "Dad's family's agency," Thomas finished. "That's why you chose them?" Michelle nodded. "They had the best reputation. I knew any family they chose would be wonderful. But leaving you there." She closed her eyes against the memory. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. I wrote you letters, Thomas said quietly. Every year on my birthday. Dad would take me to the agency, but they said they couldn't forward them because it was a closed adoption. I wrote you letters too, Michelle replied. They were supposed to give them to you when you turned 18, but then the agency closed. She reached into her box and pulled out a bundle of papers. These are copies. I always kept copies. Thomas took the letters with shaking hands. Can I? Of course. Michelle watched as he unfolded the first one, dated the day she'd given him up. My dearest baby boy, he read aloud, his voice trembling. Today I had to make the hardest choice any mother can make. I'm giving you up because I love you more than I love myself. He couldn't continue, tears falling onto the paper. Michelle instinctively reached out, then hesitated, unsure if he would welcome her touch. But Thomas surprised her by grabbing her hand. All these years, he whispered, I thought maybe you didn't want me. That I was just a mistake you needed to fix. No, Michelle said fiercely. You were never a mistake. You were the best thing that ever happened to me. Giving you up, it broke my heart. But seeing the man you've become, knowing you had opportunities one could never have given you. Did you know I'm studying to be a doctor? Michelle smiled through her tears. Yes. Your father is very proud. So am I. The heart condition, Thomas said suddenly. That's from you? She nodded. When I found your prescription in the bathroom, it was just another sign. Another connection. They sat in silence for a moment, still holding hands. Then Thomas asked, what happens now? That's up to you, Michelle said gently. I know you have a wonderful life, a loving father. I'm not here to disrupt that. If you want me to leave. No, Thomas said quickly. I mean, I don't know exactly what I want yet. This is all so overwhelming. But I don't want you to leave. He paused. Would you tell me about the day I was born? Michelle felt her heart swell. Of course. It was a Tuesday morning, just before dawn. From the doorway, unseen by either of them, Robert and Mrs. Jenkins watched the reunion unfold. 2 decades of separation were beginning to heal, one shared story at a time. The next morning dawned bright and clear, the day of the adoption awareness event. Michelle woke early, her eyes puffy from a night of tears and conversation. She and Thomas had talked until well past midnight, sharing stories, filling in 20 years of gaps, looking at old photos together. As she dressed for the day, there was a gentle knock at her door. It was Mrs. Jenkins, carrying a breakfast tray. Thomas asked me to bring this up, she said with a warm smile. He thought you might need your strength today. The gesture brought fresh tears to Michelle's eyes. On the tray was a handwritten note, Mom, is it okay if I call you that? Would you still come to the event today? I've made some changes to my speech. Thomas. At the convention center 2 hours later, Michelle sat in the front row between Robert and Mrs. Jenkins, her heart swelling with pride as Thomas took the stage. The audience, a mix of adoptees, birth parents, and adoptive families, fell silent as he approached the microphone. I had a different speech prepared for today, Thomas began, his voice steady and clear. I was going to talk about my ongoing search for my birth mother, about the questions that have followed me throughout my life. But something remarkable happened last night. His eyes found Michelle's in the crowd. My search ended in the most unexpected way possible. A murmur went through the audience as Thomas continued. For the past month, my birth mother has been working in my childhood home. She took a job as our housekeeper, not knowing I was the baby she had given up 20 years ago. And I, not knowing who she was, shared coffee with her, told her about my medical studies, even invited her to this very event. Michelle felt Robert's hand cover hers supportively as Thomas went on. Some might call it coincidence. I call it destiny. Because last night, when the truth finally came out, I learned something profound about adoption. It's not just about the moment of separation, it's about every moment that follows. Every decision that leads us back to each other. My birth mother made an impossible choice 20 years ago. She loved me enough to give me up, to ensure I would have opportunities she couldn't provide. And my adoptive father, he gestured to Robert, loved me enough to give me those opportunities while never letting me forget that I was chosen, wanted, cherished. Thomas pulled out one of Michelle's letters from his pocket. Last night, I read letters my birth mother wrote to me over the years, letters I was never able to receive. And in them, I found not abandonment, but love. Not rejection, but sacrifice. She wrote to me about her hopes for my future, her dreams for my life, her constant thoughts of me. And somehow, against all odds, life brought us back together. To everyone here today searching for answers, searching for connection, don't give up. Your story isn't over. Sometimes the answers we seek are closer than we imagine. Sometimes they're right under our own roof. The audience laughed softly at this, and Thomas smiled. But more importantly, I want to share what I learned last night. That love doesn't diminish when it's shared. That family isn't just about blood or legal documents, it's about choices we make every day. My father chose me. My birth mother chose to give me a better life. And now, we all choose to move forward together, not as separate families, but as one expanded one. After the speech, as people wiped away tears and applauded, Thomas made his way back to where Michelle and Robert sat. Without hesitation, he hugged them both. Cameras flashed, capturing the moment, birth mother, adoptive father, and son, their journey coming full circle. Later that afternoon, back at the mansion, the three of them sat in the garden. Mrs. Jenkins had prepared a special dinner to celebrate, but there was still time before they needed to go in. I've been thinking, Robert said, looking at Michelle. Your position here, if you'd like to stay on, we can adjust your role. Perhaps as house manager, working alongside Mrs. Jenkins? She's been talking about semi-retirement. Michelle glanced at Thomas, uncertain. I wouldn't want to complicate things. Mom, Thomas said, the words still new and wonderful to her ears, I want you here. We have 20 years to make up for. Besides, he grinned, you make better coffee than Mrs. Jenkins. I heard that, young man. Mrs. Jenkins called from the patio, making them all laugh. Are you sure? Michelle asked, looking between father and son. Robert smiled. Family belongs together. However unexpected the path that brings them there. That evening, as the sun set over the mansion, Michelle stood at the window of what was now her new suite, no longer in the staff quarters but in the family wing. Below, she could see Thomas and Robert playing chess on the patio, their heads bent in concentration, so similar in their mannerisms despite having no biological connection. She thought about the twists of fate that had brought her here. 20 years ago, she had walked into Richardson Family Services desperate and afraid, making the hardest choice of her life. Now, by some miracle, that choice had led her back to her son, and to a family bigger than she could have imagined. Opening her journal, Michelle began to write. Dear Thomas. Today marks the beginning of our new chapter. 20 years ago, I gave you up so you could have a better life. I never dreamed that life would lead us back to each other, or that your adoptive father would welcome me with such grace. As I watch you both from my window, I realize that love doesn't divide, it multiplies. And sometimes, the hardest choices we make lead us exactly where we're meant to be. You asked earlier if you could call me Mom. The answer is yes, 1,000 times yes. I've been your mother every day for 20 years, carrying you in my heart. Now I get to be your mother in the light of day, watching you become the amazing man you are. With all my love. Mom. As she finished writing, she heard Thomas calling from below. Mom. Dad's cheating at chess again. We need a referee. Laughing, Michelle closed her journal and headed downstairs to join her family, the one she'd lost and found, the one she'd chosen and been chosen by, the one that had been waiting for her all along. In the warm evening light, three people who had once been strangers sat together, sharing stories and laughter, their separate paths finally merging into one. And in that moment, Michelle knew that sometimes the longest journeys lead us right back home, to a place we never knew we were looking for, to a family we never knew we had, to a love that had been there all along, just waiting to be found.